Good morning, and welcome to another lecture of the Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series. And today I have the honor, as the moderator for this course this semester, I have the honor of presenting and sharing a little bit of what I do here at Saddleback. You were able to read my brief little bio I put together, and I've been teaching here at Saddleback since 2014, art history and also history. And shall I say, I love what I do. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you can give me just a moment here while I move some screens around. And I am so looking forward to our time together. All right, fantastic. So we're going to be looking at defining modern art and a closer look at the beginnings of Impressionism. During our time together, we're going to be looking at, I'm going to ask you actually to consider some things, what it means to study during this time period, especially with the Impressionists, and the idea of traditions, and also the idea of hierarchy, especially hierarchy in painting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Salon, what it was, and then the Impressionist role within the Salon. And then we're going to set the stage because I would love to share, and I can't wait to share actually, the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. But we have to kind of understand that it was this perfect storm of events that occurred that helped, I wouldn't say catapult, but just, the climate of the times made it, I think, an ideal moment for our Impressionist friends to have and launch their first exhibition. And then at the end, of course, any questions you may have, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So let's get started. When we look at considerations, we need to consider the difficulty it can be, especially when studying the Impressionist painters. Another aspect that makes this group very unique is the fact that they were all friends. Not all, let me take that out. Most of them were friends. They definitely had dialogue together. They hung out together. They painted together, sometimes literally side by side, they're painting together. The same scenes, the same landscapes and such. So when you're studying this, you need to be, as a researcher, very careful because it's not just having a year and a title or a subject matter. Here's an example. Here we have, just to give you a visual, here we have the Grand Canal, Venice. This was done in 1908 by Monet. Okay, so, oh, beautiful. However, when you're looking at paintings that he did of the Grand Canal in Venice during the year 1908, for most artists in other time periods, that would be fine, and you could find what you're looking for. However, in this case, for example, we have this painting that he also did in 1908, but this is called Le Grand Canal. So I hope, especially when you see the two side by side, because if you're reading a primary document that is explaining, you're going to see that they're going to be talking more or less about the same painting. So you really need to have a little bit more documentation, but more importantly, just know you are truly looking at the one painting that someone may be referencing or that you want to share as well. And we're going to see more examples of that when we look at the actual paintings that were in that first exhibition in 1874. Now, the other consideration I'd like for you to take into account, and is this idea of painting traditions. So why is this important? Well, it's pretty interesting how when we're defining modernism, we're looking at more or less who broke the rules first. But yet there was still a very stronghold of tradition within the world of art, and especially when it came to religious paintings. Now, granted, the subject matter, religious paintings, probably didn't leave too much artistic freedom. And yes, most of these paintings were commissioned by somebody for someone or some place very special. However, it is very interesting when you're looking at some of these themes, these Bible stories, and how these traditions lasted hundreds of years. Throughout that time, we do see some innovations, but more or less, we're looking at the conventions, what people did before them. They kind of put a slight spin, but then they do their painting in their respective time period, and then kind of, time marches on. So I'd like to share an example of probably a story or paintings that we're more or less familiar with, and that is of the Last Supper. That is the story where Jesus and his disciples are in the upper room and they're having the Last Supper, and he is saying, one of you will betray me, before they leave and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. So the first one we're going to look at to kind of get an idea of these traditions within this story, and that is Orthodox Russian icon, 13th century. So a few things just I'd like for you to notice. Notice how the disciples are sat around the table, how they're placed. Notice where Christ is. In this case, he's over here. I think I can put, there we go. He's over here, and we know where he is, right? Because of the gold halo. And then notice how he is positioned in relation to the disciples. So this is 13th century. So now we're going to go another 100 years to 1304 to 06 by Giotto, one of the, some say the father of the Renaissance. But you can see in his version, one of his versions of the Last Supper, we have the disciples around that table with their backs, some of their backs towards us as the viewer. And then Christ is over on the far right side. Now let's jump forward about 150 years. And we have this Last Supper by Dietrich Bautz. And now we see a change. Now, in this case, we have the table, still that square type table, disciples back to us, so they're around the table. But one thing out of many that I want to point out is that you see these other figures here. You have this gentleman here, two gentlemen here, this gentleman here also sharing or serving rather. Now, some might think, oh my goodness, you're up there as a server, why would you want to be seen as a servant? Well, these are actually men who would have been very recognized during the contemporary times when this painting was done. It was actually commissioned for a civic organization. And those men were the leaders, the movers and the shakers, one could say. And even though they were portrayed in a very humble manner, being a servant, that was fine with them because they were on the same plane as Jesus. And so therefore their status is elevated because of the space they occupy with the other figures. So again, something very interesting to look at. So now this was done in Northern Europe. So now let's go back to Italy, down south, and we have this one, Cosimo Rosselli, 1481 to 82. So now we see the beginnings of another innovation, and that is putting most of the disciples on one side. I say most because you see this gentleman in the center, he is separated, and that is Judas. Now that was another innovation that had started prior to this time. Rosselli did not start that. We have evidence that that had been occurring at least since the beginning of the 15th century. And again, you see the servants not really interacting, but they're there. And this actually has a very privileged place. This is actually in the Sistine Chapel. And so therefore that elevates this painting even more so with its placement. Now, a few later years after this painting, we have probably the icon of the Last Supper theme, and that is, of course, with Da Vinci, 1495 to 98. Many innovations, very much a studied painting. I'll just mention two. The first innovation that he did was to place all the disciples on the same side of the table. So you notice Judas is included within the disciples. Now, another innovation, and that is the moment in the story that Da Vinci decided to depict. And that is after he says, one of you will betray me. And they're all like going, who, me? Who, you? Is that you? Me? You? With the finger pointing and such. And that was something new that we hadn't seen or people hadn't seen. So now let's fast forward to another innovation. So now this actually more or less becomes the norm. Everyone knew of Da Vinci. We know that artists would go and see his work, much like they did seeing other masters throughout the timeline of art history. But now we're going to go look at another artist who did an innovation that we don't see until a couple hundred years later. And this is Tintoretto. So I'll just tell you two of many that we could spend on this painting alone. As you can see, yes, the disciples are all on the same side of the table, but you can see how he gives us this beautiful diagonal line of the table. Instead of having it horizontal, we have now this diagonal. That's one. The other one is that not only do we have the biblical story, so we have the story happening here, but he also gives us elements of a spiritual story also occurring all on the same plane. And actually, let's go one step further, because he also has us have another story within the servants there as well. Now let's move forward about, let's say about 50, 60 years. And this is a painting by Nicolas Poussin. He was a French classic painter, very much a mover within the academy over there. And you could see how he has that table with disciples around it. And however, what I've since learned is that this is more the style, traditional style of a Jewish supper, with the men lounging in front. So now let's go to another point of view, and that is by Giovanni Domenico Tiepolo, done in 1750. He, I guess some say, kind of still has the backs of the disciples towards us, but he gives us more interplay away from the actual story that is taking place here, with Jesus. One thing I do want to note that is kind of interesting is that researchers have been questioning, why this? Well, the story goes that at that time, the church that he was painting this for was doing renovations and such. So they literally had that in real life. And so he literally just painted what he saw and then put the story in front of the setting. I find that very interesting. So now let's continue on. And now we're into 1886. And here we have Franz von Ude, and this is from Germany. And you can see how he somewhat brings back that diagonal composition. However, look at our perspective that he gives us, where Jesus actually kind of has his back towards us. And so it presents a very unique perspective to the Last Supper. And then now let's go now to the 20th century. Here we have The Last Supper by Salvador Dali, that traditional square type table. The idea of disciples around, right? We have two of them towards the back of us. However, he does bring in that spiritual element that we saw with Tintoretto by having the body of Jesus up above. And then some say Christ pointed to it, as he knows what he has to do or what's coming in store for him. And lastly, I'll just leave you with this. This is by Marisol, 1986. So by the 20th century now, we have the Last Supper also being placed in these giant, large installations. And you can see this is influenced by Da Vinci. But not only do we get the Last Supper, we also get the viewer right here looking at the Last Supper. So again, why is this important? Well, it's important to see this string of tradition that was occurring, because the beginning of modern art is defined as who started breaking the rules. So in defining modernism, we want to remember that, okay? Who started breaking the rules? Well, we know our Impressionist friends did, but let's see what occurred also and what the latest research gives us. So let's start by what's the dictionary's view, or the dictionary's definition of modern art. It says, or modernism rather, it says the modern artistic or literary philosophy and practice, especially a self-conscious break with the past and a search for new forms of expression. And I love that idea of searching for a way to express yourself. So traditionally, typically, researchers thought that the beginning of modern art was here. As you can see with this painting by Camille Pissarro, the Boulevard Montmartre, afternoon, 1897. During this time also that I'm showing you, we do have the Salon, and we're going to get to that. And that was the more traditional conventions, and they were the ones that were, quote, officially defining art. But we do have our Impressionist friends, as you can see, we're breaking the rules, right? That finding that form of self-expression. Well, people then were like, okay, yes, we can understand how the Impressionist friends did break the rules. However, we have to look at realism. Gustave Courbet, and we'll hear a little bit more about him in just a moment. He's considered the father of realism. This painting here, though, is called The Gleaners, done in 1857 by Jean-François Millet. And now they're saying, okay, these painters, they were the ones that were breaking the rules. And that's clearly evident. But let me show you how. It's evident by subject matter. Because traditionally, and we're going to hear about that with the hierarchy of painting, traditionally, you didn't do paintings about peasants or even landscapes, much less a peasant gleaning, gleaning, picking up the leftovers from the wheat harvest that had occurred, or from a harvest that had occurred. Jean-François Millet says this. He says, to tell the truth, the peasant subjects suit my temperament best. For I must confess, even if you think me a socialist, that the human side of art is what touches me most. And so we get that in his paintings. This is just one example. Now, Courbet famously also says, in regards to realism, he says, how could I paint an angel if I've never seen one? And he has a point there, if you think about that. So another thing, in going back to the subject matter, is that these figures that you see on your screen could also be called what we call monumental. Not because they're super, super large, but because, for example, if this figure was to stand up straight, their head might even bust through the top of the canvas. Likewise for these figures here. In other words, that the figures are taking up most of the space within the plane of the painting, or the surface of the painting, and telling their story. And when you think about it, that's pretty amazing that he thought that this story was so worthy of telling. Okay, we got to move on. I could share so much more. So researchers went back and like, you know what? When we're looking at earlier paintings, we actually do see some more rule breakers. And that comes in the form of the students by Jacques Louis David's students. He was the grandfather of neoclassical art in France, before, throughout, and after the French Revolution. And here's a list of his students. Now, the one in yellow are the ones that we may hear about the most. And the one down below, in gray, down here, we're going to look at some of his work. And his students have now been looked at in how they retained this idea of neoclassical features, but also challenged the rules. And in this case, again, was subject matter. And nothing shows that more, a good example, and that is this, Le Grand Odalisque, done by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, done in 1840. Rule breaker. So sure, the settings, but the idea that it's a nude and it's not in the mythological story, which was the only accepted place at one time, if it was about mythology and things like that, that you could do a nude. And we're going to see some examples of that accepted place. So alone, the glance, I mean, we could continue on for this. Oh, I just love this painting. It's so beautiful with the textures and the colors and the light. But in showing all three of them, I would like you to see how, as researchers are taking a closer look at these different art movements, they're they're kind of moving back this timeline and this beginning of modern art. So now the definition of modern art, according to the Tate over there in London, says modernism refers to the broad movement in Western arts and literature that gathered pace and is characterized by a deliberate rejection of the styles of the past, emphasizing instead innovation and experimentation in forms, materials, and techniques in order to create artworks that better reflect modern society. And I would also put in modern contemporary society, meaning modern society at that time. So again, when we look at these three, I'm hoping you can see how each of these were rule breakers as we pushed back that timeline. So now the other consideration that I had mentioned, and that is the hierarchy of painting. Now, this was a formulation done by a gentleman named André Philibien in 1667. And he was an architect and wrote theory about art and such, and mainly in regards to French classicism. And so this is how he describes this hierarchy of painting. He says, he who produces perfect landscapes is above another who only produces fruit, flowers, or seashells. That would be a still life. He who paints living animals is more estimable than those who only represent dead things without moving. And as man is the most perfect work of God on earth, it is also certain that he who becomes an imitator of God is representing human figures, is much more excellent than all the others. A painter who only does portraits still does not have the highest perfection of his art and cannot expect the honor due to the most skilled. For that, he must pass from representing a single figure to several together. History and myth must be depicted. Great events must be represented as by historians, or like the poets, subjects that will please. And climbing still higher, he must have the skill to cover under the veil of myth the virtues of great men in allegories and the mysteries they reveal. So that's how he defined this hierarchy of painting that really became, well, I guess, like the standard, and people adhere to this. Let's see what that looks like, though. So for history paintings, and all of these paintings come from the Getty collection, history paintings are rather large paintings. They could be as big as probably, one of your walls in your study room or even your living room. But they were meant to capture these very important moments. Here we have Regatta on the Grand Canal in honor of Frederick IV, King of Denmark. And this is done by Luca Calavarige, done in 1711. Portraits, well, that's I think a simpler one to understand. It's here we have a portrait of John Talbot, later the first Earl Talbot. This is done by Pompeo Battoni, done in 1773. And this was actually also considered a grand tour portrait, hence his very relaxed pose and the vase and the statue behind him, which is saying that, yes, I saw these on my grand tour, which is another lecture for another time. And this is a rather large painting itself. Probably at least 8-9 feet, tall at least. And this is something that would have been done in Italy, but then shipped back to the family estate in the country and probably displayed. The next level down is genre or everyday scenes. And here we have the music lesson by Gerard Debauche, done in around 1668. So everyday scenes. Then we have landscape. And this is Landscape with Lake and Boatman by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, done in 1839. The next level down is animals. And this is The Piebald Horse by Paulus Potter, 1650 to 1654. And then the lowest of the low, as Vivian said, and this is Still Life with Flowers and Fruit. And this was done by Claude Monet in 1869. And so here they all are. So history paintings, again, are those important historical events, religious events, could also be mythological or allegorical subjects. Portrait painting, then genres, which are scenes of everyday life, landscapes or cityscapes. And actually, in the Dutch, by a Dutch theorist, Samuel van Hoogstraten, he actually called landscape artists were the common footmen in the army of art, just to show you how common and how low regard landscape were seen. And then we have animal paintings and then still life. So this was started and then became and was promoted by the academies in Europe, especially between the 17th century and the modern era. And we know that it was a very stronghold, especially became very influential within the French Academy. Now, so we have our considerations that we need to do. So let's learn a little bit more of this Salon system, because that plays a very pivotal role in the story of Impressionism, and definitely with our Impressionist artist friends. So what was a Salon? Well, for a time, especially before 1648, there was no official provision for any type of public display of or exhibition for art. And that changed with a major reorganization that occurred in 1663 to 1664, and that was led by the chief minister of Louis XIV, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and the painter Charles Lebrun. And so they wrote a bunch of articles, and Article 25 said that there was to be a General Assembly in the Academy and on the first Saturday in July, and that people could, each officer could bring art. So this is a very casual displays. And so therefore, not all the time would they have space and the likes, but then that changed. So the timeline of these events for the Salon. In 1667, we actually have an official art exhibition started under Louis XIV for the graduates of the École des Beaux-Arts. Then in 1737, the public now officially is allowed to view. In 1748, we have a jury system of selection used, meaning that you would submit a work of art, and there's a group of people who would say, yes, we like it, or no, we don't. And of course, the yeses got to be displayed, the no's you would come up or you would pick up. And something else happened. We'll hear about that in just a moment. But this also became a point of contention because of who served on the jury. So it almost seemed up until the 19th century that this is a push and pull relationship between the artist and then the jury system. Then we have in 1749, international artists were allowed. We do have records that very prominent American artists were part of the Salon. Thomas Eakins was one of them, for example. Whistler is another one. And of course, Marcel Cassatt and such. In 1791, however, the government takes over control, official control, I guess one could say. So that also meant the jury. And then in 1855, the Grand Salon that year was actually part of the Great Exhibition in Paris that occurred. Now, during this time, especially within the early 19th century, we see other exhibitions and other salons start springing up. And so in 1851, we have the Great Exhibition that took place in the Crystal Palace over in England. So of course, not to be outdone, we have the Great Exhibition now in Paris, where the Salon art exhibition was part of that. Also during that year, we have the Pavilion of Realism. And that was done by Gustave Courbet. And hold on, we'll get to that in just a moment when we talk about him. And then here we also have, then in 1863, we have a new salon that started, the Salon des Refugiés. And this became, it was started under Napoleon III. as a way to show all this art that would get rejected. And to give you an idea of these numbers, that year, for example, in the Salon, over 5,000 works of art were submitted. However, 2,200 of those works of art were rejected. So they didn't want an uprising. They kind of, I guess some people said, that there's still a lot of good art here that didn't get selected. So then he said, well, let's have another salon, and that's going to be the Salon des Refugiés, and we'll see where they met in just a moment. So then here we have in 1874, the exhibition of Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, otherwise known as the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. By 1884, we have the Salon des Indépendants, and that was established by Georges Seurat, Paul Signon, and Odilon Rendon, and it actually continued all the way up to World War I. And what made this salon unique is the fact that there was no jury. Everybody got in and everybody had their artwork displayed. And then we have in 1903, the beginning of Salon des Automnes, which actually still continues today. Now, here is the Place des Industries, which is where that first Salon des Refugiés took place. In part of this, the officials said, well, just give them part of that area for the Salon des Refugiés exhibition, and they'll be fine. But going back to this other exhibition, the Pavilion of the Real, we kind of need to talk a little bit about that because of this, as an example of this complex relationship that these artists had with the Salon. So now the Salon is the official art show. It is endorsed by the government, and you'll see their other role that they play in within art. And if you made it to the Salon, that could catapult your career and such. So I say the Pavilion of the Real because the story goes that year in 1855, Gustave Courbet was very upset because his paintings were rejected. And so he famously says, fine, I'm going to go off and do my own exhibition. And so here we have a photograph. This is actually called Fireman Station, Paris Universal Exhibition, 1855. And you can see how they believe that it was really a picture of this gentleman here, a fireman, but we happen to see this here with Courbet, and they believe that that's where he had his very first exhibition. Now, and I find that fascinating. This is from the Victoria and Albert Museum. So yes, he had some paintings that were rejected and he took them and he had his own show. However, this is the Grain Sifters, and this was actually one of 9 paintings that were accepted into the Salon that year. And some say the number could be even as high as 11. Now, Courbet, like much of these other artists, did get his start or his early stardom, lack of a better word, I suppose, in the Salon. So early in his career, he did get into the Salon. He actually won the gold medal, so as the best in show of that year. And up until that point, or actually a little bit after, if you won the gold medal, you never had to do the jury system, right? Because you were also already proved to be the best of the best. So therefore, your work automatically got into the Salon. However, Gustave Courbet kind of pushed the envelope, I think, a little too much because of his submissions, some of his submissions, that rule was changed rather quickly, some say, in that they didn't care. Now the new rule is that everybody has to go through the jury system, regardless if you won the medal or not. So I find this interesting because the typical story is that we hear that he was upset. He started his own show going back to 1855 now, but we know that he had paintings in the Salon. Here's another example. Here is the Salon of 1852. And I circled this painting here. And that gives you also an idea of what the Salon actually looked like. And we'll see some more examples soon. But then we go, so what is that painting? What is that painting? This is on the Salon of 52. That painting is this painting here. This is Young Ladies of the Village, done in 1851 to 1852. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art over in New York. And while we might say, oh, that's a pretty painting and such, this was actually very criticized, heavily criticized during the Salon. And critics called it tasteless and clumsy. One of their complaints, among many, meaning the subject matter, why are you, why this scene, this is of no consequence, definitely no consequence to paint. But one thing that was interesting is that he was criticized. These are actually his three sisters. He used his three sisters, Zelly, Juliet, and Zoe. But critics said that they were too country. They didn't look, they looked too normal, that he should have used models. And they were they had too much common features. So again, just to show you that relationship of how the artists were in the Salon, heavily criticized. And in this case with Courbet, he actually comes back to the Salon later in life as well. And we'll see an example in just a moment. So one actually a very interesting thing about the Salon is that we have drawings such as this. This is a engraving done of the 1785 exhibition by Pietro Antonio Martini. And so these artists would come and they would painstakingly, because I can't imagine this being a very fast process, but would draw every painting that was in a certain gallery. And this, I believe, is one of the central galleries. Now, also, it gives us a wonderful insight to how the paintings were hung. And you can see where they're kind of stacked upon each other, like a puzzle piece, with all the different sizes and such. And today we do still call that the Salon style. And during this time, artists would always fight because, of course, everybody wanted, their paintings down here at eye level. The exception being these rather large history paintings up here. And that same discussion, point of contention, also was evidenced over in our Impressionist friends, and we'll see a little example of that as well in just a moment. But going back to this drawing. So what art historians have done is that they've looked at these paintings and to pick out paintings that we know and that we can easily, or not so easy, but identify. And so I circled one of the main ones. Some of you may recognize it, and it's this painting here, The Oath of Horatii, done in 1784. This was done by Jacques-Louis David, and he actually made it into the Salon of that year, as we can see by evidence, and it was his first royal commission and was enthusiastically received. Everybody loved this. It was meant to show the idea, with the monarchy in mind, to show selflessness and patriotism, and the idea of heroic sacrifice as well. So I love that, how we have even more of a backstory of this wonderful painting by Jacques-Louis David. So now let me just shift a little bit here, as we can see now some of these interior shots. Here we go. There's the one that we just saw here with the paintings that surrounded it, to give you an idea of what the Salon looked like during the 19th century. So we have the Salon of 1852 on the left, and then we have the Salon in 1855 on the right. Now, some of you may say, something looks awfully familiar right there. And yes, that is the Grand Odalisque, because during that year, because it was part of the Great Exhibition, that they actually allowed living artists to exhibit works that they have done throughout their careers. And so therefore we have a large retrospective exhibitions were done of Ingres' work, Delacroix, Vernet, for example, that hung in the French galleries. Here is another look. This is from the 1850 Salon, and this is the sculpture and painting galleries. And these are photographs by Gustave Legray. And here again, the 1852 Salon, also by Legray. And then here is another one. And to also show, again, how their paintings were stacked. But a big change came when the awards were given out. And once the awards were given out, all the award winners would go into their own galleries. And so there was this big shifting. And so then everybody would come back the next day to see where their new location of their painting or a painting. But all the award winners were kind of put together. And then here is the sculpture. And this is from the 1864 Salon. Now, one thing that we do know is that the Salon was very political, especially when the government took over, right? And I share this as an example of this painting. So this is Avenue Between the Chestnut Trees at La Salle St. Cloud, done in 1867 by Alfred Sisley. And you're probably saying, well, how can a painting of trees be political? Well, some say that this painting was accepted into the Salon because of who owned those trees. We know that during this time, Sisley was staying in a lodge or a home located in this forest that was owned by Napoleon's family. So some say that this would have been very recognizable to those government officials on the jury, and they'd be like, oh, wow, we need to put this in. It's Napoleon's family, and so therefore it got into the Salon. Again, just gives you the idea of the politics that took place, and we'll see another example in just a moment. Now let's go back to the Salon of 1870. So during this time, this is a very pivotal moment within the Salon history and timeline, because this is the first year where the artists finally were able to elect the entire jury selection committee. Therefore, they voted out any government art official because, as in the past, you had people on the jury that really had or knew nothing about art. So this year, the Salon was very large. They had 5,434 entries. And some say it was because finally, artists believed that there was a fair jury selection. Now, as you look at this, you might be recognizing some of these paintings. Point out here, maybe up here, perhaps this one here. So let me go ahead and go to the next so we can see the names of some of these paintings. So here we have, let me go up a little closer for you. So here you have Basile at the top. Let's see, we have Sicily over here. There's Sicily's. And actually, we might see one of them in just a moment. Here, let me go back here. Oh, we have more so right there. Now, this is 4 years before that first show, remember? And I want to keep that in mind. Here we have Gustave Courbet. It's right there. We have Edward Manet here, Renoir. Tissot is here as well. Degas, right there. So in 1870, we have our Impressionist friends still showing at the Salon. But again, granted, it could be because finally, right, artists are, or the jury who knows something about art is selecting, true art or good art. Well, I can't say that because that could be a tricky. Then that asks the question, well, define good art. And that's very subjective. But during that year, this actually was a Grand Medal of Honor, and it was awarded to Tom Robert Fleury for his last days of Corinth. And so that was considered. Now, this does follow those traditional lines of conventions, right? History painting, mythological setting. So therefore, you're able to do nudes. And so this then became kind of like the Salon style that we refer to in today's research. Here's a picture of the artist in his studio. And yes, it was posed. It was posed. So that brings us to 1874. Now, these are the paintings that were in the Salon. Just a slight example. Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, Marceau, and Cezanne, they didn't submit anything, right? Because they were going to start and organize their own Impressionist exhibition opening up in April. But some of you may recognize this painting here in the center. It was out here on loan to the Norton Simon several years ago up in Pasadena. And this was by Manet's The Railway, done in 1873. He did not want to participate in that first show of the Impressionist Friends. But this does give you an idea of the other art that was shown. And so let's kind of just take a quick look at some of these artists here. So we saw, again, Manet. You have Alma Tadema is another one as well. And the gold medal winner that year was this one. This was by Jerome, and it's a painting of Cardinal Richelieu's confessor, of Friar Father Joseph, descending a staircase. This was highly acclaimed and received the top medal of honor as the top prize, best painting that of 1874. Now, again, some say that it's because of who was in the painting was the reason why it was selected. So again, could be an example of that political nature within the Salon. But the Salon was more than just showing paintings and more of just, the government kind of flexing an artistic muscle. What they also did, and I like to consider this, the French go shopping, but they would actually peruse the Salon. So think about, thousands of art. In this case, 1874, you have over 5,000 works of art to choose from. And these are just some examples of art that was selected. And you're probably wondering, well, why would the government buy all that art? Well, it was because they would buy art to show, or to display rather, in government buildings throughout the country. So here is just a snapshot of what was bought in the Salon of 1874. So somewhere in France, shortly after, these were being displayed. So now let's look at our friends, meaning the first Salon acceptance of the Impressionist painters, again, to show that very complex relationship they had. So first we have up is Jean-Patrick Basile. And this is the family reunion, 1867-68. And it actually was in the Salon of 68. He was in 2 other salons, but unfortunately his career was cut short as he died in the Franco-Prussian War. Next up, we have Cezanne, who did the artist's father. And this was actually done in 1866. However, it was accepted finally into the Salon of 1880 or 82. They're not quite sure, but this was his only work to be accepted into the French Salon. And some say it was because it was of his father. Here we have Degas, and this is the Suffering City of New Orleans that he did in 1865, also in the Salon that year. And his mother was from New Orleans. Yes, the New Orleans in Louisiana. And Degas does several paintings of his time that he spent there. Next up, we have Edward Manet, the Spanish singer, 1860. This was in the Salon of 1861. However, his first appearance was in 1859. I was just unable to find the actual painting that was submitted and accepted. Here we have Claude Monet, Le Pont de la Laive at low tide, done in 1865. So this was his first Salon. His last Salon appearance was in 1880. So after and during the Impressionist exhibitions. Here we have Morceau. This is the old track to Alvers, done in 1863, and was in the Salon of 1864, and appeared 6 more times, up in the last being 1873. Here we have Camille Pissarro. This was in the Salon of 1865. And we'll hear more about him, I'll say that. Here we have Renoir, portrait of William Sisley, 1864, and it appeared into the Salon of 1865. Now, again, another example of this complex relationship with the Salon, because I love to show this painting. This painting was actually in the Salon of 1879 and was very purposeful. So you figure the first Impressionist show was in 1874. So during that time of those exhibitions, Renoir goes back and paints the portrait of Madame Georges Charpentier and her children, Georgette Berthe and Paul Emile Charles. And he painted this because Madame was a high society lady. So the story goes that he painted it knowing that it would be accepted because of who's in the painting, high society lady, and then knowing that she would have her, hold on one second here, that she would have her friends, high society friends come. Okay, hold on. All right, I'm not quite sure what happened, but give me one moment. And let's see. Okay, let me find you. Hold on one second here, slight pause. But my story goes, I'll just continue the story, that she would have her, okay, let me see. Let's go from current. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, I think we're good now. Let me try to redo this. I apologize. I'm not quite sure what happened. We had a short glitch, but let's go ahead and continue on. The story goes that she would bring her own high society friends to come, and in doing so would have he know that he could get potential clients. All right, my friends, let me see here. And I think we're back in business. So let's go there. Wonderful. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened, but we're good. So he did this, some say, as a business transaction because he knew that when she brought in her friends that it would create more business for him because they would want something like she had. So I love that story. Okay, so the last painting I wanted to share about our friends, and that is of Alfred Sisley. And we've already kind of talked about this. It made it into the Salon in 1868, but also made it into, he was also in the Salon of 1870. So that just gives you a glimpse of that relationship with the Salon and how the Impressionists got their start, or it's admitted early on in their careers, to the Salon. And as I shared, some of them actually went back, even though we had those Impressionist exhibitions. But it was more than just that, right? So we have to set the stage because I had shared with you at the beginning how it was almost like a perfect storm that was occurring that made it just seem like the right time for this group of artists to really venture out and have their own exhibition. So let's start in setting the stage, and we're going to look at some different factors because we're asking ourselves, why now? Why in 1874 was that a good time? So hopefully this will give you an idea or better understanding. So let's first look at art. So here we have Joseph Mallard, William Turner. This is Norham Castle, Sunrise, done in 1845. And you can see, I hope, those Impressionist characteristics that I'll list in just a moment. Very influential with the Impressionists, especially with Pissarro and Monet, and I'll share that in just a moment. Here's another one of my favorites of him, and I made it larger so we can get a little up close. You can see this beautiful kind of vortex that he gives us with his paintbrush and the colors kind of leading to the center. And here's the steamboat in distress, even though it was considered, the latest technology at that time. This is a snowstorm steamboat off a harbor's mouth done in 1842. And some say that this is actually a statement towards the Industrial Revolution. In other words, saying that no matter how a big and powerful man's machine is, that ultimately nature is the one that's, more powerful. And I guess that idea of the storm encompassing the steamboat. But when you look at these two, I hope you can see some of these what we now consider impressionist ideas. We do know that Pissarro and Monet both went to London to escape the Franco-Prussian War. And in a letter Pissarro wrote to Winford Dewhurst in November of 1902, he writes of that time. He says, in 1870, I was in London with Monet. Monet and I were enthusiastic about the London landscapes. Monet was working in the parks while I, staying in Lower Norwood, then a charming district, studied the effect of fog, snow, and spring. We were working from nature, and later Monet painted in London some superb fog studies. We also used to go to the museum. The watercolors of Turner, as well as the works of John Constable, certainly had their effect on us. We admired Thomas Gainsborough, Thomas Lawrence, Joshua Reynolds, and others at the Royal Academy. But we were particularly taken by the landscapists who were nearer to what we were seeking in plein air, light and fleeting effects. Now, Wilford Dewhurst actually gets the wonderful distinction of writing a book that was published in 1904, so 2 years after this letter, called Impressionist Painting, Its Genesis and Development. And this was the first important study of the French painters of this time to be published in English. Key there, published in English. Let me just show you briefly a work of Wilford Dewhurst, because he was also a painter. And here's his French landscape that he did, called French Landscape, done in 1895. So that idea of art, and they had seen Turner's work. But then we also have politics, very political time during this with the revolts and the communards, and etc. On the left is a satirical illustration depicting Gustave Courbet holding a small mallet and hammering at a small pile of stones. It's a hand-colored lithograph done in 1871. And it was meant to mock Gustave Courbet, who had painted his first probably famous painting, the Stonebreakers, that he did in 1849. Hence came, him breaking the stones, because Gustave Courbet was charged as leading the effort to bring down this. So let me go to give you a picture. To bring down the column of Vendôme. That was in the middle. You can see it's there after it had been pulled down. Some say that he was the one in charge of turning the bolts, but this occurred in May 16th, 1871, when they believe that Courbet pulled down, led a group of communards, but then was thrown in jail, convicted, thrown in jail, had to pay back the money and such. So in jail, though, he was allowed to still draw. And one positive thing that came out is comes from his drawings that were also being published. Now, I should have a slide for this, but I don't, but I'll just say this, because during this time, pamphlets, which would be like small little magazines, I guess, in today's vernacular, were being published by all sorts of groups during this time. So if you had something to say, you can more or less find a group. So while, even though he was in prison, there were pamphlets and magazines who would print his drawings. So there was a place for this to be. Gosh, kind of reminds me a little bit about today. In any case, so one positive is that he kind of exposed that children were living in the prison and the harsh conditions that they were going, because they were there with his parents. So it did lead to a certain amount of reform to get children out of these prison and some of these horrible conditions. And so here's an example, young communards in prison that he did during this time in 1871. Also, we have a rebuilding of Paris. So during this time, around this time, and in this photo, this is the Rue Saint-Nicolas de Chardonnay. And This is done sometime between 1853 and 70. They're not quite exactly sure, but it was done by a Charles Marvier. And it shows us the narrow streets that were very typical of Paris, but what was also occurring when we look over here to the left. And so here we see an elevated view of narrow cobbled street with fenced off, cleared off area on left. That's part of the title. Because what they wanted to avoid is what was happening. And here's an example. This was actually taken in 1848. And you can see how there were barricades here. And this these barricades occurred during another time of rioting. And the Salon actually that year had to close, because the riots were so bad. But they were trying to rebuild Paris into what it is now today, right, with its very wide boulevards to avoid situations such as. So all of that now leads us up to Impressionism. The typical time frame that art historians tend to give this movement is 1862 to 1892. However, Impressionism in its style is still continuing. And one thing that we just don't have time for today, but if you're in my classes, we definitely take a deeper dive, is that Impressionism, we track its transfer of knowledge because it ends up all around the world, including places like Egypt. And I just can't wait to share that. Unfortunately, we just don't have time here today. But here's an interesting quote by Claude Monet, and he says this: Impressionism is only direct sensation. All great painters were less or more impressionists. It is mainly a question of instinct. So the Impressionist exhibitions, we know they have the first one that was 30 artists, and they did 165 works of art. And as you can see, I won't necessarily read all of this, but how the artists' numbers tend to kind of start to decrease just a little. And then the artworks, though, stay the same, which is kind of good, right? That these artists have the ability to share their work. Here's a third exhibition in 1877. Then we have the fourth exhibition. Now we're down to 16 artists. 14 were listed in 79. We know that Marie Bracmond, Paul Gauguin were at the last minute. And by this time, we have 15,000 people coming compared to the 4,000 that attended that very first exhibition. And so now we're starting to see increased crowds rather, and which also meant acceptance. And then we have the last two exhibitions, 82. We know Cassatt was there, but she comes back in 1886. And then we have another woman, Impressionist Marie Bracmond, and then no more. Because by that time, they didn't feel that it was necessary anymore. They weren't seen as these avant-garde, modern, wild artists that they were first perceived as in 1874. And that's actually pretty cool when you think that within 12 years that they were more or less, quote, accepted. So let's take a closer look then at that 1874 exhibition. This is a painting of the photographer Nadar, and that was his kind of art name. But he is very important because it was in his photography studio that he allowed the Impressionist painters, he was friends with them, and he allowed them to use the space to host that first show. Here is the first page of the catalog that one would get. The show was led by Monet and Degas and Renoir and Pissarro. And also during this time, it cost 1 franc to get in. It was from April 15th to May 15th, 10 to 6, and then dinner, and then from 8 to 10. And in that first exhibition, around 3,500 to 4,000 people came, but they considered that a failure because most of them were coming to laugh at the work. So here's a picture of the photography studio that Nadar allowed them to have. Now, to give us an idea, so let me share this too, because they found now that they're a cooperative anonymous association of painters, sculptors, and engravers. And That was their group. Members of this association, though, were expected to not participate in the salon anymore. However, we know that didn't happen. So I don't know if that was much enforced. But let me give you an idea of what the salon looked like for them. Now, we don't really have any photos from 1876, 74, that first show rather, but this is the show in 1882. And so the same argument came up that most of the artists wanted their work down here at eye level, very few up on top. But I hope, and so one thing I do want to share is this painting here, again, doing what other artists did for Martini. And in looking at that painting, I'm like, I know that painting. And that painting is this beautiful painting here. And this is the two sisters on the terrace done by Renoir that he did in 1881. And his art dealer actually showed this work in this exhibition here, and you can actually see where it was hanging. So, there it is. So now the characteristics of Impressionism, and some of you may know them, capturing a glimpse, right? Not just everyday life, but just a glimpse of life in general. The brushstrokes, light and dark, but mainly light. Color, or eye's perception of color, because also during this time, there are many discoveries, scientific discoveries, especially about the optics of the eye, because they had learned that you have one color with another color to give you a third color. Again, another lecture for another time. Open composition, and then the subject matter. And we start seeing that right with the rule breakers, Millet, and then Ingres, definitely with our Impressionist friends. Now, this painting here is Impression Sunrise. And this is actually the painting that gets the credit for the name of Impressionist or Impressionism. That was due to this gentleman here. This is Louis Leroy. He wrote for a magazine called Le Charivari. And on April 25, 1874, he printed his review with a title called The Exhibition of the Impressionists. And it was a term taken from the title of Monet's painting. And so in this article or this review, he writes in the form of a dialogue between two viewers, one teacher, one master. And so this is where he writes and where we get the name Impressionism. He says this: I glanced at Burton's pupil. His countenance was turning a deep red. A catastrophe seemed to me imminent, and it was reserved to Monsieur Monet to contribute the last straw. Ah, there he is, he cried in front of number 98. And that was the number of the painting. I recognize him, Papa, Vincent's favorite. What does that canvas depict? Look at the catalog. Impression Sunrise. Impression. I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. So therefore, very critical of this painting, but I'll show you in just a moment that Leroy wasn't happy with anything he saw that day, obviously. Not all our critics, though, were as harsh. There were some that were supporting the efforts, and perhaps in my next lecture, I'll have a positive review because there were a few. But the name Impressionism comes from this review based on this painting, and the painters themselves kind of took it like a badge of honor, and they called themselves the Impressionists. And then soon that term stuck, and then here we are today. But here's an example of how Leroy wasn't happy with anything. Here is Renoir's dancer from the National Gallery over in Washington, D.C., and this is what he says about that. He says, what a pity, he said to me, that the painter who has a certain understanding of color doesn't draw better. His dancer legs are as cottony as the gauze of her skirts. I find you hard on him, I replied. On the contrary, the drawing is very tight. So to me, I think that's stunning and beautiful. However, we are looking through, 21st century eyes, lenses, But again, Leroy wasn't happy with anything he saw. So now we're going to take a look at some of the art that was actually in the exhibition. And so kind of just sit back and just let your eyes kind of take it in as if you were roaming the different galleries. Here's a list of the artists that were all there. The ones in yellow are the ones that we tend to know the most about. I probably should have put Eugene Boudin in there because although he's not an impressionist, his work was in the Impressionist show, and he was that wonderful transition between realism and Impressionism. So here we go. Here we have Zachary Ostruck, The Chinese Gifts. He actually was in 3 works in the Salon during that year. Oh, here we go. Antoine Fernand at Tendu, Still Life with Chicken. Here we have Edouard Villiard. And we know that he had 4 of his paintings in that first exhibition. They say that this is probably one of his most famous. But what's interesting is how he dropped out of the 3rd Impressionist exhibition, and eventually he moved into politics. And he actually became the mayor of his hometown. The last paintings we have of him, though, are dated 1880 to 1882. And he was friends with Cezanne and Pissarro, who he actually painted with during the 1870s. Eugene Boudin. And here is another wonderful photo of him painting, because this is another intervention that also helped our Impressionist friends, and that was the portable art studio. That and the train. So now artists were not restricted to just the city. They could hop on the train, bring their studio with them, as we see here as he's painting on a boardwalk, and they could go out to wherever the train took them and do their painting and then come back within a day. Here we have Felix Bracmond, and what's interesting here with this drawing is that it's a drawing that he has of his wife, who was also a painter, who finally we see her work in the last Impressionist exhibition, that she's actually painting her sister. And so this was a print that was actually in a magazine called L'Art in 1879. And that was the year that both Marie and Felix exhibited. Here we have Edward Brandon. Adolphe Felix Kaus. Originally, he was an engraver. And then his paintings were accepted into the Salon as early as 1846. He also was part of the Salon des Refusés. Now, another unique feature about these artists is that they were friends. They supported each other. Bazille, his family was very wealthy, and he often bought paintings of the other artists to keep them afloat. And Kaus is another example, because when Monet became very ill in Algiers, it was this gentleman who provided support and helped Monet get stronger and helped him return back to painting and such. Here we have Cezanne, probably his first masterpiece, and it was one of 3 works that he had in that first exhibition show in 1874. It was actually purchased by Count Armand Doria, who was a patron to many, or rather, I should say, several of these artists. And I wish we had time, because that's a very important role during this time, is the role of the dealer and the patron. And then now we have Gustave Henry Collin. And this is an example of his work. And you're going to see that in some of these slides, meaning that we no longer have the actual painting that was in that show. We can only show something very similar to what was described being in that show. And that would be this painting, the Picador with the bull. That's what he was known for. He was actually very successful in the Salon as early as 1857. Again, he had the same patron of Count Doria, and he actually went to visit Count Doria several times with both Manet and Corot. Here we have Louis Debras, and again, another example of his work. And he also was an art critic. And part of that is because they wanted to invite and have art critics and artists together to be in the same show. And then also to show that this exhibition was not another Salon of the Refused, right? They didn't want that kind of association to be seen with them. Edward Degas, laundress, he was in 7 out of the 8 exhibitions. This is Armand Guillaume, and he was very faithful to the Impressionist group. He was in 6 of the 8 exhibitions. And then was a very good friend of Cezanne and very good friends with Van Gogh, who actually appreciated Guillaume's use of color and the bright color palette that he would use. Louis Latouche, here's an example of his work. Again, we have several of his, we know what they were named, but we just can't find the actual paintings. We know that there are actually some missing paintings in the book at some of the later exhibitions that he was in. But he was actually in the Salon as early as 1866. And the last one in 1882. Stanislas Lepine, he also was in the Salon as early as 1859, all the way up to 1880. And here's Leopold Lever. And what's interesting about him is that he first actually was a designer of military uniforms, but it was his friend Edgar Degas who actually turned him into a landscape artist as well. And they just didn't have paintings. Here's an example of Alfred Meyer, that, again, this idea to have different types of works of art. And so here's a painting of his work, enamel painting with grotesque and foliate forms gilded. And then we have probably the most famous Impressionist, I think, and that is, of course, Monet's Poppy Field. And again, in there, it was acquired by the art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, and eventually through other dealers and collectors, finally donated to the state of France in 1906. First owned by the painting department in the Louvre, and now over at the museum, Musée d'Orsay. Here we have Morisot. She was the only woman to be seen, and she, according to the exhibition catalog, exhibited 14 oils paintings, pastels, and then 3 watercolors. Here we have an example of work they attributed to Duvrage, meaning that they strong assumption believes that it is his actual work, but they might not have that hard evidence to say by. So that's why they say attributed. But he was friends with Cezanne and Degas, Monet, and Renoir. He was actually in 2 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. And then here we have Auguste Otten, where with his son, provided 10 sculptures to that first exhibition. And then here we have Pissarro, who was the only one believed to be in all of the Impressionist exhibitions. And he was actually good friends with Cezanne. And so the story goes that it was Pissarro who encouraged Cezanne to paint outdoors. And so the 2 artists often worked side by side on the same grounds, different locations. And so again, remember in the very beginning, right? Having those 2 artists, sometimes even painting the same thing to make sure you have the right painting. Here's another famous one by Renoir. And this was the first exhibition. And then he also was in the one in 78. Because remember, he was also in the Salon, remember, with Madame. Henry Riart, he actually was a former student of Millet. And he participated in the exhibitions in the Salon in 1868. But then he also, in addition to being in 7 of the 8 exhibitions of the Impressionists, he also became a collector and a patron himself of Delacroix, Colbert, Millet, Corot, Manet, Renoir, Morisot, Toulouse-Lautrec, Pissarro, Degas, among others. So a big patron and collector. And then here we have another example. This is of Leon Paul Robert's work. He was actually 25 when he was in that first exhibition, and we don't have much about him, unfortunately. During the show, he showed 2 watercolors, and this is kind of gives us just an idea of what his work was. We see his last work, I think, when he was about 34 years old. We just don't see much. And then we have Alfred Sicily. This is the Isle of the Lodge that he did in 72. And this was actually painted during the floods, the flooding that occurred from the Seine during that year, which it started in October and ended in December of that year. And what I love is that we have his rendering, right? He's painting what he sees, but I love how it reflects. Here's a photograph of that in the city of that same floods. So I love that, to compare the two. So I hope you enjoyed your kind of deep dive into what it meant to be early modern art, and then just highlighting our time in that first exhibition that occurred in Paris of the Impressionists of 1874. Here is some of the classes, if you'd like to join me, that I teach. I teach art history on Mondays, where we go from Baroque to Impressionism. So we're going to do this again, but again, spend more time, which is good. And then we have art appreciation, which is an asynchronous class, but that's why I look at art around us. We have weekly themes, in addition to looking at collectors and collections and the role of the museum. And then just another class I teach, and that is the History 510, History and Biography through Media, where we look at historical events and how the media portrays them with fact versus fiction versus fact, mainly looking at movies. So you're still able to join. And the way I design my classes is that it's not too late to join. You can still come in and not feel like you've missed out. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share here. There we go. And let me kind of switch things around here real quickly, and then we'll answer some of these questions that I know were coming in. So thank you for that. And what's also kind of nice being here that I'll just read the questions and I will answer them in our last few moments together. Okay. And so one question came in regarding the Salon exhibitions. Were there any ledgers showing who brought what and for how much? Well, some of the ledgers that we do have are what the nation spent, for sure. We would have to look at, I think the best records we may have would be of an artist, a specific artist perhaps, but nothing that has come out to say, not like we have, for example, of the Armory show. We actually have ledgers of paintings that were sold that the first Armory show that happened over in New York. Let's see. And then, so I hope that helps. Another question that came in, I do understand that there were 2 salons in 1874, one mainly traditional, but the other for the Impressionists. Yes. A good way of saying that is that one was the Salon, the official art show, and the other one was, I wouldn't say for the Impressionists, but by the Impressionists, meaning that they put on their own show to finally have a place to show their art as they wanted it to be shown. Can you discuss the differences between salons and exhibitions during the period? I think the words are kind of they're intertwined, the salon. The salon was a gigantic, exhibition of art. Yeah. But excellent questions. Okay, and then now moving over here to chat. I see some great questions here. What is the time period for modernism? Well, I hope after this lecture that you can see how it's changing. But now most art historians, especially considering current research or scholarship of the last 10 to 15 years have modern art starting with the Romantics. Now they're still doing more research, absolutely, and so I expect more papers to come out that will be that will help define it more, and examples in art. We saw just one, of many artists during that time. So roughly the very beginnings of the 19th century, I think, and kind of just moving all the way up. Well, we still consider art after World War II up until the 60s and 70s as modern, and then we go to contemporary, which tends to be art of the time. But excellent question, thank you. And then a question about who got to be the judges. And so I'm assuming that's with the salons. Until the artists were able to vote who they wanted to be judges, it was just government officials. That we know there was a minister of art, so obviously he was it, but just because you have the title doesn't necessarily mean that you have the background to be that you knew about, what art is and such. Because one thing I want us to take away is how, I guess in a way, how restricted being in the salon with its traditions and the same conventions and such was prior to 1860s, definitely the 1870s, when the Impressionist exhibitions start occurring. Very, very traditional. So prior to that time, prior to 1870, if your buddy was on the committee and they need another person, they might knock on your office door. Hi, can you help us out? And then what caused the art being allowed to view art, or what caused the public? Great question. So real quickly though, I need to define the public. So by public, we don't mean that the doors were open and everybody could come in. We do know I believe there was a slight charge, but it definitely still was a place of privilege. So just think a more wealthier, family. But what caused the public to be allowed to view art? That's a great question. And the cause of it, I'm just not quite sure. So that's something I think I'm going to actually research. I'm going to put that on my research question, because here's a thought. And I don't know this. I'm just thinking this kind of like, as a researcher thinking, I'm wondering if it had to do with sales. Because if you have all this art and you're showing it for your school, so you already have that built-in audience, but you want the art sold, what do? You invite the public in so that they can spend their money. So I would be interested to see if that had anything to do with it. So far in my research, I haven't found anything definitive about even about why the public was finally allowed to view art. So, okay. And yes, someone put in that it reminds them of the Festival of the Arts in Laguna Beach. Absolutely. Between the Festival of Arts and then across the street, right, the beginnings of the Sawdust Festival. So excellent example of today's modern times. Okay. So let's see, we have a great question coming in also. So were the artists who were famous, did they all do large bodies of art? And then was anyone who was famous who only did a few great paintings? I would have to say yes and yes. One thing that also is unique with our Impressionist friends is that they were, I guess I could say this reflecting back, that they were kind of like an everyday man, right? They were a group of artists that may have started at a art school somewhere, someplace, but somehow found each other, during this time, and they just painted. They were actually able to paint for the sake of painting. So, but they definitely were not famous during that time, hence the support of the richer or more wealthier ones supporting the ones and buying their art to give them some income. But I would have to say that there were artists that were famous during this time who did do large bodies of work. Actually, Turner, great example, had a large studio. He would have exhibitions, and it's so funny. So, a quick story, because in England at the Royal Academy, when you did an exhibition, you were able to make a couple last minute touches that were allowed, as kind of like, little touch ups in case something happened to your painting as they were hanging it. But he, being business savvy, would actually, it's kind of funny. He actually would come with a half a canvas completed, and would sit and complete the canvas and talk up, to people. Oh yes, oh hey, which I love, that idea. I did get some people upset because I thought he was doing it on purpose, but that's one way that he did and was able to create business for him. So large body of works, and again, I believe there were others who just did a few great paintings. It all just depended upon, I believe, how they were able to support themselves. Because this cost money, right? You had to have canvases, you had to have brushes, and also this is also a time where we start to see manufactured paints, that you had to go buy, and such. So excellent, excellent. Great question. So another question that came in was a portrait of Madame Georges Carpentier commissioned. Yes, absolutely, it was commissioned for Renoir to do. Yes. So great question. Let's see. Do you agree that breaking the rules started with those that broke in Romanticism? Yeah, okay. So I'll just read the question. It says, do you agree that breaking the rules / tradition started with those that broke neoclassicism towards Romanticism, towards realism, towards Impressionism, following with what happened afterwards, which is post-Impressionism and Fauvism, and then non-representational and abstraction? Okay, great question. Yes, because you just have to look at what art was starting to come out. Because remember, we had that hierarchy of painting, and it was very specific about what was considered art and what was considered rather good art, even great art, history being the top, portraits being next, and so forth, and going down. So they are taking looks at these artists that were breaking the rules, and I just showed you example of each that kind of shoved aside that hierarchy of painting. And it makes sense also when we look at the majority of what we saw in that first Impressionist exhibition, which were a couple still lifes, a lot of landscapes, and such. So absolutely. Now you do bring up a good point, and I'll just share this as well, is that after Impressionism hits, we have art kind of going in two different directions. One direction is where we now have artists that are more geometric focus, meaning about the shape. And so think Cubism as part of an offshoot is that. The other is more concerned about color and the color palettes, and using color as a sense of expression, hence Expressionism. Think Edward Monk's famous The Scream, as a great example of that offshoot. So excellent. And then another great question, what rules are we breaking from tradition in our current time? Every rule, every rule is and has been broken. But in a way, though, I think that is good, because you have artists that truly have a sense of freedom. And that's something we also have to take into consideration, that artists didn't have as much freedom as we think one would or should have had during that time. I would say up until realism, when they're just out there painting. We had the whole Barbizon school around that time, where they're out on the outskirts of the little town Barbizon, and they're painting what they're seeing. So what are they seeing? They're seeing cows, beautiful paintings, but of cows in the landscape. And so they have that freedom. And I think now, with all the different types of mediums that artists have, absolutely, breaking the rules. You'll still find some traditionalists that may paint, but again, okay, now this is another discussion for another time. If I'm an artist and I'm painting something and I want to have a living, I may have to pivot, to what sells. So that's a whole nother discussion um, that we could have in this world of art. All right, my friends, I think with that, I was able to, let me just quickly triple check here. I'm on 3 screens. Oh, here's another great question that came in. Do you think photography affected the painter's style and expressions? At that time, no, because here's what's also interesting, and this is another part of lecture. Those of you that are in my class, we're going to talk about this, but it's interesting because we know that some of these artists actually took photographs of their own work. And so I don't think it affected their style and expressions because we see them still doing the same type of quote style and such just during this time, because not photography wasn't seen as a mode of art. Now it is, right? We have photography in all the top museums in the world, but it wasn't seen that way. And oh gosh, I don't know if is it Degas? We actually have photographs because he actually takes photographs not only of his work, but of like Nadar. Oh, his name escapes me, but it's one of our Impressionist friends. But he used it more as a tool because we do know that a lot of these early, not a lot, several of these early photographers did that. They would go to the museums and take pictures of paintings, take pictures of cathedrals. And those of you who went to the special collections with me a couple of years ago, we saw some of those early photos of Gothic cathedrals. So I think they thought it more of a tool, but not necessarily something that affected their style or expression. Now, however, I think that also changes once the 20th century hits. And therefore, we have more avenues of expression, but we still have photography. And so it would be interesting to see how those two correlate with each other. But excellent question. All right. And I think now with that, my friends, I think we are done. So I want to thank you again so much for coming today. I had a lot of fun and I hope you did too. If you think of any questions, please shoot me an email. I would also say that if you want to carry on the conversation, please go to our discussion board that will open up shortly and then send me your impression and your thoughts. What did you think about today? So have a great week and take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.